Thank you very much, and it's wonderful to be back in Melbourne today. Unfortunately, I can't travel there because your country is a fortress, but hopefully one day you'll all get vaccinated and I'll be able to visit again soon, and you'll be able to visit here because it's been a long time between connections between our two countries. So for those who don't know me, I moved to Jerusalem 4 years ago from Melbourne. Before that, I was a high school teacher at Mount Scopus, King David, at Das, a bit at a few other places as well. And I now am the Jerusalem correspondent for +61J Media. And I'm also the education director for Kids for Peace Jerusalem, which is an interfaith youth movement for Israelis and Palestinians. Our office is based in Sheikh Jarrah, and I've been working there for the last 2.5 years, facilitating meetings between Israeli and Palestinian teenagers, where a lot of what we talk about is narratives, and I assume that's how I came to be giving this talk today. So as Joey mentioned, I'm going to talk for about 45, 50 minutes, and then after that, we're going to have an opportunity for questions. But I want to begin with a question that I have for you, which is, I know last week you heard about Jewish nationalism and the story of Zionism. If you can write in the chat anything you know about Palestinian nationalism. Do you know any thinkers? Do you know any movements, any slogans? Just be interesting for me to hear, when you hear the word Palestinian nationalism, what comes to your mind? What have you heard about? And there's no right or wrong answers. You can write whatever you like in the chat. Could be dates that you know about, events, just what comes to your mind when you hear Palestinian nationalism, in the same way that last week you heard about Jewish nationalism through the Zionist movement. So if you want to talk as well, Joey can unmute you, but otherwise you can write in the chat. I'll just give you a second to think. Okay, so we've got from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Began in 1965, question mark. The Nakba of 1948. Definitely from the river to the seas, that is a very common one in the Palestinian narrative. Muslim Brotherhood, also from the river to the sea. What does that phrase mean? Which I'll get to in this talk as well. So that's great. So that's some of the topics that we're going to look at. So I'm going to begin today with Ottoman Palestine. And the place where I want to start today is in 1850. So in 1850, there was a movement called the Nada. The Nada, pretty similar to the Renaissance or the Haskalah, it's an Arabic word that means the awakening or the Renaissance period. And it's something that happened throughout the Ottoman Empire, and it involved growing acceptance of French and European ideas that a people can be a nation entitled to political rights, some aspects of women's rights, science, and more importantly, secular concepts of Arab nationalism. This happens obviously in response to the French Revolution, which also gave birth to Jewish nationalism, which Sonia spoke about last week, in the form of Zionism. So one of the things that happens in Palestine as a response to the Nada is that before 1858, local Palestinians who lived here didn't own their land in the form of registration, because before 1858, everyone just believed the land was owned by God. There was no like registration process or documentation or anything that we have now. Families could maintain the land, but the notion of sort of private property as you have in Europe obviously was very foreign to this region. And villagers didn't even have a need to register their land, because everyone knew among themselves who lived on which parts of the land and who owned what, based on the small communities that were living here that were often very, very separated. Then in 1858, there was an Ottoman land code passed called the Tanzimat, and this law said that everyone in the Ottoman Empire has to register the land they're cultivating, both private homes and also grazing land as well. Now, many peasants were very reluctant to register their land, because as soon as you register the land, you have to start paying tax on that land, as exists everywhere in the world where you have property taxes. And Also, you could be conscripted to the army to fight for the Ottomans, which again, not everyone wanted to. But what they did here in Palestine was that a sheikh would claim ownership of very large pieces of land so that every individual owner wouldn't have their name written as the owner of that land. And sometimes these sheikhs lived in Palestine, but often they lived in Syria or Lebanon, and they came what to be known as absentee landlords, meaning that they were the landlords of the land here because they were registered as the people owning that land. But the people who are actually living here didn't actually know that their land had been sort of registered with this absentee landlord from Syria or Lebanon or someone they hadn't met. And also at the time, the Arabs living here, barely more than 5% could actually read. So this wasn't really something that they understood what was happening here as this land became registered through the Tanzimat regulations. Then what happened was, again, I won't go through the whole Zionist narratives, but you know of the pogroms in Russia and the various reasons why Jews wanted to return here. So there were two very wealthy Jews. The first is Baron de Rothschild, and the second is Maurice de Hirsch, who was a German Jewish financier and philanthropist who set up a charitable foundation called the Jewish Colonization Association. And they started acquiring land from these absentee landlords. This fund had 11 million pounds in it. It was the largest charitable trust in the world at that time. So we're talking about immense amounts of money to buy this land from these the landholders, which is obviously legal, in order to provide a place for Jews for Jews to obviously establish a state eventually. In the Zionist narrative, Rothschild and Baron de Hirsch are obviously very honored. There's streets named after them, there's parks named after them, because it's seen that the actions they did of buying this land was obviously a very positive thing. For the Palestinians, though, in their narrative, this was seen as theft, because they viewed that their land was being sold by someone else who was from Syria or Lebanon to someone else who was in Russia or in Europe somewhere without their knowledge. And that really is part of the core of the conflict in addition to 1948, but that notion of the land that I live on being taken away from me. So in 1913 is where you see the first real, I would say, violent dispute over land. It happens in a place called Rehovot, which you can see on the photo of the right is now a very large Israeli city, but back then it was a very small place where there was a Bedouin community. And I want to just show you 5 minutes of, or even 3 minutes of a clip called 1913 Seeds of Conflict, of what happened when this first dispute happened over land that had to do with all the issues I just told you before about the Tanzimat regulations. So I'm going to now play the video.
Early settlement called of the Jews who came wanted to stay, and then they would sort of disappear into Palestine. And it was impossible to track them or to get them to leave once they had arrived. The first Aliyah nearly triples the number of Jews in Palestine. And from an early settlement called Rehovot comes fresh evidence of the first dispute over land between the new arrivals and their Arab neighbors.
Rehovot was established by a group of colonists in 1890, some 25 kilometers southeast of Jaffa. And there was a group of Bedouin living there. They cultivated the land, but they were not the owners. And when Rehovot was established, the colonists asked the Bedouins to leave. And the Bedouins rejected it. They thought that they have rights on the land. They lived there, they cultivated it. Even though they were not its owners, they still believed that they deserved some compensation.
Turkey, a petition has just been discovered. In it, the Bedouins plead their case to the Sultan after a tense exchange between the Arab Abu Hataba and the Russian settler Levin Epstein.
قبيلتنا فيها 32 عيلة مخلصة للدولة العثمانية دام الله خيرها. هذه القبيلة من أيام قديم الزمن، أيام آبائنا وأسلافهم اللي
что они уничтожат их своими стадами. Мы попросили их покинуть нашу землю, но они утверждали, что они ее арендовали.
صاروا يطردونا بعيد عن مكان عيشتنا، وكل ما نتنازل لهم أكثر كل ما عارضونا مع مقاومة شد. خذوا المزرعة بالقوة، وصار الأجنبي يرفض معاملتنا حسب المعايير المقبولة بين الفلاحين وحسب معايير الإنسانية والشفقة، واستولوا على أرضنا.
In Istanbul, incidents like Rehovot are dismissed as insignificant, merely local misunderstandings. But in Europe, a new brand of Jewish identity called Zionism is gaining momentum.
Oh yeah, you're on mute, hang on.
Okay, great. Okay, so just from what you've seen from that clip, and if anyone wants to speak, then just raise their hand. So the land in Rehovot is purchased by Jews from these absentee landlords. So there's, I don't know the names of them, but they're people who live in Syria or in Lebanon. And then the Bedouins say, hold on, my land has been sold. What are you doing building a settlement here? This is taking away my land. And so they complain to the Ottomans about what's going on here. And then the Russian Jew says, yeah, but I've paid for this land legally. You know, I didn't do anything illegal. We bought the land and we have a right to live here. And that begins, you know, that example from Rehovot. I think it happens all over the place, but that's sort of the first one that we have documented, really begins what is the seeds of the conflict. Now, I know this is hard because a lot of you obviously have a lot of background in this, but when you look at that situation between that Bedouin man and the Russian Jew that you saw there, who do you think is right? Like, who do you see as having the just story in that incident in Rehovot? Anyone that wants to speak can raise their hand. Yeah, Eva. Joe, if you can unmute.
Yeah,
Eva.
I'm just going to turn off, so you guys can unmute yourself now if you'd like to.
Okay, great.
Do so.
Yeah.
Thanks. Well, I think they're both right. That's the problem. It's a cultural clash that they don't understand. They've got completely different ways of understanding ownership. And it's perfect. They're both perfectly understandable. It's easy to understand that they're both have a case and they're both right.
Yeah, and I think the what you point to the cultural misunderstanding is very powerful. Libby's just asking a link to the video. If you Google 1913 Seeds of Conflict, it's on PBS, and I think it's on YouTube and those sorts of places. The whole documentary goes for an hour. I just showed you a few minutes of it. So going back to the slideshow, where are we here? So so what happens next after 1913 is that there are waves of aliyah, and those aliyah, again, I know Sonia spoke about it last week, so I won't go into all of them, but before that first aliyah happens in 1881-82, 96% of Palestine is Arab, meaning the majority of people who live here are Arab, Bedouin, etc. They don't see themselves necessarily as a nation. I'll get to that a bit later, but they are by far the majority here. The Jews that are living here that were here before 1882 are mainly in the old city of Jerusalem, in Sfat, in Jericho, in Hebron, in places like that, but not not really in Tiberias as well, but not in a large population, because as I mentioned, the majority is Arab in 1882. The first ever written communication that we have between an Arab and a Zionist leader comes from Yusuf Dia Pasha al-Khalidi. Khalidi was an Ottoman politician. He was also the mayor of Jerusalem from 1870 to 1879. And he wrote a letter to Sadok Khan, who was the chief rabbi of France, and he asked him to pass this letter on to Theodor Herzl. Remember, this is 2 years after the first Zionist Congress. Maybe I'll ask Rosie if you can read this letter for me. This is what Yusuf Dia Pasha al-Khalidi writes to Herzl.
Starting from who can deny the rights?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yep. Who can deny the rights of the Jews to Palestine? My God, historically, it is also your country. However, since Palestine is already inhabited, Zionists should, quote, find another place for the implementation of their political goals. In the name of God, let Palestine be left alone.
Thank you. So you can see already there in 1899, this Arab leader is saying, I understand that Jews have a connection here. That's in our Quran, that's in our tradition. We know that there are Jewish holy places here, but there's already a people here that you know, and if you want to establish this Zionist project, establish it in Uganda, establish it somewhere else. Don't do it here. And Herzl's response is fascinating. David Schulberg, if you're happy to unmute, this is what Herzl writes back to Yusuf Dia Pasha.
Okay, the Zionist idea of which I am the humble servant has no hostile tendency toward the Ottoman government. In allowing immigration to a number of Jews, bringing their intelligence, their financial acumen, and their means of enterprise to the country, no one can doubt that the well-being of the entire country would be the happy result. It is necessary to understand this and make it known to everybody. As Your Excellency said, the Jews have no belligerent power behind them, neither are they themselves of a warlike nature. They are a completely peaceful element and very content if they are left in peace. Therefore, there is absolutely nothing to fear from their immigration.
So, thank you, David. So you can see there Herzl saying, look, we don't come with any intention of violence or ethnic cleansing or genocide, you know, any of it. We're coming here in peace. We're coming here with money. We are bringing intelligence. We're bringing financial acumen, and this will be good for you. And you don't need to worry about us coming here. And what's amazing about this exchange of letters, even though they're written over 120 years ago, is if you jump onto any sort of online discussion about Palestine and Israel today, people are saying exactly the same thing. It hasn't changed. So the Palestinian narrative until today is exactly what Yusuf Pasha Dia said, which is find another place to realize your political goals. And the Jewish narrative is we come in peace and don't have a hostile tendency towards you, and if you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone. So you can see already in 1899, you know, the dynamic of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is present within this exchange of letters. In 1905, Najib Azouri, who is a Christian Syrian author, writes a book called The Awakening of the Arab Nation, and he identifies already that there's going to be a conflict. He says, two important phenomena of the same nature but opposed are emerging at this moment in Asiatic Turkey. They are the awakening of the Arab nation and the latest efforts of the Jews to reconstitute on a very large scale the ancient kingdom of Israel. These movements are destined to fight each other continually until one of them wins. Again, so it's just another example. I can find more quotes like this, but you can see already that the Arabs in 1905 already are aware that this is not going to end peacefully, this clash between Jewish and Arab nationalism. Then comes World War I, and there are a series of broken promises that involve these six men, Balfour, Weizmann, Sykes-Picot, Hussein, and McMahon. Just briefly, because I'm sure most of you have heard of this. So the first series of exchanges is the McMahon-Hussein correspondence, where McMahon implies in some way that there is going to be a state for the Arabs in Palestine in exchange for the Arabs revolting against the Ottomans and supporting the British in World War I. Then you have the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which essentially divides the entire Middle East, assuming that there will be an Allied victory, of course, which there was at the end of World War I, and that's what the map looks like. And then you have the modern Middle East today, which is very much shaped by these promises or these broken promises and these visions that they had. The Sykes-Picot agreement was a 9-year process that many Arab Palestinians really view as the source of sort of Western imperialism that caused so many of the problems that exist here to this day. After, due to Australian help, I should note, Beersheba is captured and Palestine falls into the hands of the Allies. There's the Balfour Declaration a week later, which is written, again, it's not a public letter, it's written to one specific individual in the name of Baron Walter de Rothschild. And it states famously that the UK view with favour the establishment of a Jewish home in Palestine. Arthur Koestler, writing about this Balfour Declaration, talks about how remarkable this is in Jewish history. And he says this line that I always, when I teach the Balfour Declaration, always jumps out at me. He says, "In this document, one nation solemnly promised to a second nation the country of a third." So he's talking about here that the British don't really own Palestine. They've been there for a week, but they're promising to the Jews the country that the Palestinians feel that they own already. And he says, Arthur Koestler writes, it is true that the Arabs in Palestine lived under Turkish overlordship, but they'd been living there for centuries and the country was no doubt theirs in the generally accepted sense of the word. It's true that the Arabs had vast underpopulated territories at their disposal and the Jews had none. The Arabs were backward and the Jews were forward people. Okay, that's a bit racist, but that's what he wrote. And then the later claimed to have received the country 3,000 years earlier from God himself, who had only temporarily withdrawn it from them. But arguments of this nature had never before in history induced any act of state of a comparable kind. 100 years later, Jews still celebrate the Balfour Declaration. The street on which the Prime Minister lives today is called Balfour Street. In fact, in 2017, when there was a 100-year anniversary, Benjamin Netanyahu went to the UK to meet with Theresa May, and they had a fancy meal and celebrations and all of these sorts of things, because in the Zionist narrative, Balfour is very, very important in giving international legitimacy to the Zionist movement and showing that the world powers support the initiative of Herzl and others who started it in 1897. Within the Palestinian narrative, there were protests on the anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. And in fact, if you go to the Palestinian Museum in Bethlehem, where I've been, it's called the Waldorf Hotel. It's like a Banksy hotel where they tell the history of Palestine. The first room is the Balfour Declaration, as in that's where they start telling their history of what they see as Zionist colonialism that took the land away from them and has led to all the suffering that has happened since. So as a response to Balfour, there's really an emergence of Palestinian nationalism. That's really the spark that lights the fire of Palestinian nationalism. In 1919, you have the first Palestinian Arab Congress, which is held in Jerusalem, and its main platform is opposing the Balfour Declaration. And then in 1920, at the third Congress, you have the first ever call for a Palestinian Arab state. Before 1920, when Arabs expressed their nationalism either through pan-Arabism, which was the entire Middle East as being one Arab state, or there was calls for an Arab state to be part of Syria. But it's really only in 1920 that you have this notion of independent Arab Palestine being requested by the British and the other powers that be in the world at that time. You can read about all the resolutions of the Palestine Arab Congresses on this Wikipedia page. There was 7 of them between 1919 and 1928, and these were the men who were present at these various congresses. So Palestinians today, if you ask a Palestinian, what's the definition of a Palestinian? I know it's different to the definition that Jews would give, but this is from Alan Doherty, who's a chair of Israel Studies, but I've heard many Palestinians say the same, and they would say Palestinians are descendants of all indigenous people who lived in Palestine over the centuries. Since the 7th century, they've been predominantly Muslim in religion and almost completely Arab in culture. What that means is that according to the Palestinian narrative, anyone from the 7th century who's here, whether you're a Jew, a Muslim, or a Christian, that has, speaks Arabic, that is connected to this land, is Palestinian. And of course, before 1948, that was what everyone was called who lived here. Everyone who lived here was Palestinian before 1948, including the Jews, and that's on their ID documents, etc. In terms of the religious connection, so most Palestinians are Sunni Muslims, but there is a small majority who are Christian. There are 3 main holy sites for Palestinian Christians in Palestine, which is Nazareth, Bethlehem, and Jerusalem. You can see the various churches here that represents the Church of the Annunciation, the Church of the Nativity, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Jesus was crucified and they believed rose from the death. And in regards to the Muslim connection, so they would point mainly to this verse from the Quran. It's chapter 17 of the Quran, which refers to a night journey that the Prophet Muhammad had from Mecca to Jerusalem. And this verse in the Quran says, "Glory to Allah who did make his servant for a journey by night from the sacred mosque to the farthest mosque, whose surroundings we did bless." So in Arabic, the sacred mosque is Al-Masjid al-Haram, and the farthest mosque is Al-Masjid al-Aqsa. Until today, the mosque there, this isn't the Al-Aqsa Mosque, by the way, that's the Al-Aqsa Mosque is the one with the black dome. This is the Dome of the Rock. But the Al-Masjid al-Aqsa is for Muslims the 3rd holiest site, and is very much why I would say pictures of both Al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock appear in almost every Palestinian home, definitely in Jerusalem, but also in many other places in the world as a religious symbol of their connection to this place. Then in 1947, there is a UN resolution to partition Palestine into 2 states. It passes 33 votes in favor, 13 against. And Fawad Hamza, who represents the Arab League, is against this, as are all the 13 Arab countries who voted against. Eva, if you can read this quote, this is what Fawad Hamza says at the UN as they're debating this resolution.
Zionism has no rightful claim on Palestine. In the implementation of their program, they have exclusively relied on the support of a foreign power regime conducting itself arbitrarily and unjustly. Their forces have been forces of repression. The Jews will have the more economically developed part of the country, embracing practically the whole of the citrus-producing area, which includes a large number of Arab producers, and the Arab state will not be in a position to undertake considerable development expenditure.
Thank you. So what he's saying is there's 2 issues here. Firstly, if you look at the map, the bits that are given to the Arabs are actually desert. The West Bank, what we call the West Bank now, is mostly desert. You can't grow anything there. And the area that the Arabs wanted was, what today we call the Gush Dan region around Tel Aviv, Yafo, which is the more fertile part of the country. So the first is they're saying the allocation isn't fair. And the second reason is they say that Zionism itself has no rightful claim on Palestine because it's supported by foreign powers, namely the British, and it's conducted itself unjustly, and it's been a force of repression. The resolution passes, as you know, and there's a dispute now within the Palestinian leadership based in Jerusalem about what to do about this. And I call them the Nashashibis and the Husseinis because they sort of represent the 2 camps. So the Husseini clan, you've probably all heard of Hajj al-Amin al-Husseini for his infamous meeting with Adolf Hitler during World War II. They led what was called the mainstream national movement, which fought Zionism to the bitter end, which was also anti-Semitic, and they believed that the Zionists should have no place here at all, and they should fight them. There was also the Nashashibis who believed that the Zionists could not be defeated, and the common good of Palestinian Arabs demanded coexistence. So if you want to put it in 2 ways, there was a discourse of justice and a discourse of the possible. Eventually, there were basically three Arab families: the Nashashibis, the Dajanis, and the Husseinis. And the Nashashibis got outvoted 2-1, in the sense that the Dajanis and the Husseinis very much were opposed to the partition, and they called for a strike 3 days after the vote. During that strike, there were riots in Jerusalem from the 2nd to the 5th of December 1948, resulting in 8 Jews being murdered in Mamilla and Jaffa Road with much property damage. In response to that, on December 12th, the Etzel, led by Eliyahu Levi, placed a bomb at the Damascus gate that killed 20 people. And there we have the seeds of what is called, for Jews, the War of Independence, or for Palestinians, the Nakba, meaning the catastrophe. So in 1948, on May the 14th, Ben Gurion declares a state. Obviously for Jews, it's a very happy occasion. Golda Meir says, you know, for 2,000 years, we've been waiting for this wondrous occasion. But for the, sorry, the screen is just frozen. But for the Palestinians, the declaration of the state of Israel is very much a call to war. You have here King Abdallah of Transjordan says on April 26, 1948, all our efforts to find a peaceful solution to the Palestine problem have failed. The only way left for us is war. I will have the pleasure and honor of saving Palestine. Azam Pasha, the Secretary General of the Arab League, also says, I foresee the consequences of this bloody war. I see before me its horrible battles. I can picture its dead, its injured and victims, but my conscience is clear. For we are not attacking, but defending ourselves. We are not aggressors, but defense against an aggression. And again, this is the exact opposite of the Zionist narrative, which saw the War of Independence very much as a war of self-defense against Arab aggression. And here you've got the flip side in the Palestinian narrative that sees the 1948 war as a war of self-defense against what they see as Zionist aggression. So if I had to give sort of a Zionist view on Arabs on these times, it would be this quote. First, I'm going to ask Joey to read the quote, and then afterwards, I'm going to ask, anyone can guess, who do you think said this? So Joey, if you're still with us, if you can unmute yourself, and read this quote for me.
It may be that some individual Arabs take bribes, but that does not mean that the Arab people of Palestine as a whole will sell that fervent patriotism that they guard so jealously, and which even the Papuans will never sell. Every native population in the world resists colonists as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the danger of being colonized. That is what the Arabs in Palestine are doing, and what they will persist in doing as long as there remains a solitary spark of hope that they will be able to prevent the transformation of Palestine into the land of Israel.
Thank you. Does anyone want to guess who said that and when did they say that? Someone you've all heard of. You can write in the chat or you can unmute yourself and say it. There's no wrong answers. Anyone want to guess? You can see in the chat, hold on. We've got Ben Gurion. Ben Gurion is not right. It's actually a nemesis of Ben Gurion. It's none other than Vladimir Ze'ev Jabotinsky who said this. So he's identifying already, the leader of revisionist Zionism is identifying that we can try and, you know, bribe these Arabs, but ultimately they're not going to give up on their land, and they're going to resist colonialists because that's what all native populations do. And later on he compares them to the Sioux and the Aztecs, and he says there's no way that they're going to accept us coming in here from Europe and saying that this is our land. And what he advocates is what's called an iron wall. He says, when the Arab leadership will pass to the moderate groups, I'm convinced that we Jews will be found ready to give them satisfactory guarantees so that both peoples can live together in peace like good neighbors. But the only way to obtain such an agreement is the iron wall, which is to say a strong power in Palestine that is not amenable to Arab pressure. In other words, the only way to reach an agreement in the future is to abandon all ideas of seeking agreement at the present. Now, again, even though this quote is from 1923, I think it perfectly summarizes The view of Israeli security thinking and the view of Israeli generals almost until this day of this notion of the necessity of an iron wall, because of that understanding that the Arabs are always going to object to Zionist colonialism in what they see as their ancient homeland, where they view themselves as the indigenous people here. So during that war, there was many destruction of villages. On the Arab side, there was destruction of the Jewish quarter, of the old city, of Neve Yaakov, of Atarot, of Kfar Darom, of Hebron, of Gush Etzion, and there was really, I know it's not a nice word, but it was really ethnic cleansing of Jews in all of these places, in these 11 villages that were forced out of their homes. And there was also, according to Benny Morris, I know the numbers change depending on historians, but at least 369 Arab villages, and you can see a map there with all the dots showing where all of these Arab villages were, where also entire populations were removed from their homes, often by force. If you look here at the Jewish population, just to see the impact of this, in 1882, as I mentioned, 4% of Palestine is Jewish. By 1948, here you can see 80.6% of the population is Jewish. Okay, and that's not because of immigration. Yes, there was Aliyah between 1882 and 1948, but the main reason why the Jewish population of Palestine is growing is because of what happens between 1939 and 1948, which is that 700,000 Palestinians leave or are expelled. I'll explain the difference between those two words in a minute, from their homes. But had those Palestinians not left their homes in 1948, there's no way that the population would have gone from 4% Jewish to 80.6% Jewish. And even till today, the Jewish population of Israel is still about 75, 76% of the population, which is clearly a Jewish majority. Palestinians to this day have a symbol, which is the key, which symbolizes a desire to return to the homes that were lost in 1948. If you go to the Ada refugee camp in Bethlehem, at the entrance of the camp, you can still see a giant key, which symbolizes that notion that one day we will return to these homes that were taken from us. So the question that is often debated when we talk about this part of history is what happened? Did the Palestinians leave by choice, or were they expelled? So I want to present a few answers here, but this could really be a lecture in of itself. But just to give you a sense of a few Israeli voices and a few Palestinian voices on this. So, Major Elad Peled says the problem, he was one of the generals during the war, he said the problem is very simple. The war is between two populations. It's not armies yet, it's gangs. We're also actually gangs. We come out of the house, they return to the house, they come out of the house and return to the house. It's either our house or their house. So what he's saying is what happened is every battle, whoever won would then dynamite the house of the other side so that they wouldn't be able to return to their houses, or so that that house could, or if they didn't dynamite it, they would just leave the house standing, but they would make it their property. The Shin Bet in 1948, this is towards the end of the war, actually released an internal report, which is now in public. You can see it on the Akevot Institute website at that link. And they identified 6 reasons why Arabs left their homes. This is again an internal Israeli security report. It wasn't designed for public consumption at the time, but it was to help the Jewish leadership understand what was going on at the time. And from their research, they found that the main 6 reasons why Palestinians left in order of priority were direct Jewish acts of hostility against Arab places of settlement, the impact of those actions on neighboring villages, operations by so-called breakaways from the IDF, namely the Irgun and the Lehi, orders to leave issued by Arab institutions, Jewish whispering operations to induce Arabs to flee, and evacuation ultimatums. The final paragraph of the report says, in April, we excelled in an increase of immigration, whilst May was blessed with the evacuation of maximum places. Without a doubt, the hostile operations were the main cause of the movement of the population. They're referring to places like Dir Yassin, where everyone heard of the violence there. Loudspeakers in the Arabic language proved their effectiveness on occasions they were utilized properly. Many in the villages of central Galilee started to flee following the abduction of notables in Sheikh Moanis, which is now North Tel Aviv, the Arabs learned that it was not enough to forge an agreement with the Haganah, and there were other Jews, i.e. breakaways, to be aware of. So that you were never safe, and that's why you had to leave. According to the document, 70% of Arabs left as a result of Jewish military operations. Even Yitzhak Rabin, in his diary, when he talks about the expulsion of Ramleh and Lod, says doing this was difficult. He says psychologically, this was one of the most difficult actions we undertook during the war. The population of Lod did not leave willingly. There was no way of avoiding the use of force and firing warning shots in order to make the inhabitants march the 10 to 15 miles to the point where they met up with the legion. So this isn't something that Israelis enjoy doing, but in the Palestinian narrative, the reason this war is called a Nakba is because of this mass displacement that led to so many people leaving and being expelled from their homes by force to make Israel have a majority Jewish population, even though within the Jewish narrative, this is very much being done out of a sense of self-defense because of Arabs firing on roads, on the road to Jerusalem, on various other Jewish settlements, and a feeling of a need to defend ourselves, that if this large Arab population stays here, we won't be safe and we won't be able to live in a Jewish and democratic state. But for the Palestinian Arabs, this was the greatest tragedy that had ever befallen them. Historian Ari Shavit writes about this, specifically this event in Lida that Rabin quoted there. Maybe Eva, if you can read this quote for me.
Mullah Cohen and Shmariah Guzman were right to be angry with the critics of later years who condemned what they did in Lida, but enjoyed the fruits of their deed. I will not damn the brigade commander and the military governor and the 3rd Battalion soldiers. On the contrary, if need be, I'll stand by the damned, because I know that if not for them, the state of Israel would not have been born. If not for them, I would not have been born. They did the filthy work that enables my people, my nation, my daughter, my sons, and me to live.
So if you look at the Zionist narrative, I think Ari Shavit really encapsulates it very powerfully. They're saying, this is not pleasant what happened here, but if this hadn't happened, there wouldn't be a state here for Jews that allows him and his daughter to live and to speak Hebrew and to thrive in what is modern Israel. But again, for the Palestinians, this was something that they can, I think one of the reasons why they still object to Zionism to this day is they see Zionism very much as a political movement born in sin, and the original sin is the Nakba. And because of that sin, there's no way to accept or tolerate Zionism in any shape, way, or form. I'm going to finish off with a poem by Mahmoud Darwish, and then I'm going to open for questions. So, Rosie, because I know you're very good at reading poems, if you can read this poem with as much emotion as you can. And I think it summarizes really everything I've spoken about in terms of the narrative of Palestinians up until 1948. Just for those who aren't familiar, Mahmoud Darwish is one of the really most well-regarded Palestinian poets, and really people that people look to express their national narrative.
Me?
Yeah.
We suffer from an incurable disease called hope. Hope for liberation and independence. Hope for a normal life where we shall be neither heroes nor victims. Hope to see our children go to school without danger. Hope for a pregnant woman to give birth to a living baby in a hospital, and not to a dead child in front of a military-controlled post. Hope that our poets will see the beauty of the colour red in roses rather than in blood. Hope that this land will recover its original name, land of hope and peace. Beautiful.
Thank you very much. So at this point, I'm going to open for questions, comments, thoughts, and please be respectful of one another. And I'm happy to hear what you have to say.
We've got quite a few that have already been sent into me, so I might just kick off with a few. Oh, hang on. Oh, there we go. So we spoke last week about the diverse range of Zionist identity that exists throughout the diaspora, and how often that diversity causes internal conflict amongst those advocating on behalf of the Jewish state. After the most recent bout of conflict with Hamas, there seems to be a renewed sense of unity amongst Palestinians across divided geographies. How do you see this growing Palestinian diaspora impacting the current conflict of ideas that exist within Israel?
So it's true that Hamas have become far more popular in recent months than ever before. I think partly it's because, I don't know if you know, there was meant to be a Palestinian election a month ago that Mahmoud Abbas cancelled. Had that election happened, I assume Hamas would have done very well. And I think what happened during the Gaza war was, you know, when you don't have elections, you do politics in other ways. And the Palestinian Authority is very corrupt. There's the Nizar Banat, you know, the case of the critic that was beaten by 27 people and then killed. There's a lot of Palestinian anger at that. And there's a sense that Hamas stand up for Al-Aqsa, they stand up for Sheikh Jarrah, they stand up for against the siege on Gaza. And I think that explains their popularity. It doesn't mean that every Palestinian supports firing rockets on Israel or all the anti-Semitic stuff from Hamas, but it is seen as like an army, like a form of self-defense for Palestinians. And I think that explains their popularity, especially in recent months.
Lauren, I see you've got your hand up. Do you want to ask your question?
It's probably a comment more than a question. But I think what's missing, Ittay, is the fact that a lot of Jews were forced to leave or chose to leave the Arab lands, and that at the same time, especially, you know, with the Ottoman Empire falling apart, it wasn't the only time where this happened. We see it happening with the Turks and the Greeks as well, where there was a population exchange. So I think it's a little bit, you know, like we're just missing that part of it, that you can't actually talk about the Arabs being forced out of Palestine without talking about the Jews being forced out of the Arab lands or choosing to leave in both cases.
No, thank you for that comment. I mean, when I do the Jewish narrative, I definitely include that, but I was asked today just to give the Palestinian narrative, and that is not part of the Palestinian narrative at all. Neither is there any awareness of that. So that's why I didn't include it. But I'll say personally, you know, my mother was born in Iraq. I very much am aware of that story and what happened to my family as a result of that expulsion, and also that within the Zionist narrative, that's a very dominant expression of if there was going to be some sort of reconciliation process for the Nakba, that there would have to be also a reconciliation process for the Jews that were expelled from Arab land. So yeah, I'm very aware of that, and I'm glad you raised that. Thank you.
I might go to another one that I had sent to me from the chat. How do you see young Palestinians advocating for their own agency? It seems as though the UN has not been an avenue of success in recent years, nor their general political representation with Hamas and the Palestinian Authority.
So I'll just give one example, which is an example I know very well, which is the Sheikh Jarrah case. I've been working in Sheikh Jarrah for the last 2.5 years in a peace organization, and it's a struggle I've been aware of for obviously didn't just start last month. It's been going on since the 1970s in the Israeli courts, and I think for a lot of Palestinians, you know, in May this year, that the 4 families in Sheikh Jarrah, according to an Israeli court ruling, were meant to be evicted from their homes, and they weren't. And a lot of Palestinians say, why weren't they evicted? Well, the court was delayed, and you know, there's various administrative reasons, but they would say the fact that that Hamas fired rockets, and that obviously made Israel not wanted to remove those people from their homes, but also the fact that celebrities around the world were tweeting and writing about Sheikh Jarrah, and many Palestinians here were uploading stories and that sort of thing, telling the story of that neighborhood, which they don't see Sheikh Jarrah as 4 families. They see it as the continuation of the Nakba. They see it as a continuation of colonialism and ethnic cleansing and apartheid and all of those sorts of things that happened in 1948. Now it's just happening to 4 families, but the next day could happen to 10 families. It could happen in Silwan. It could happen anywhere in East Jerusalem. And so the reason Sheikh Jarrah became sort of such a symbol within the Palestinian narrative, because it was part of that campaign struggling for our rights to live as a free people in our homeland. Quoting from Hatikva Liot Am Chofshi Be'artzenu, but in Arabic, the idea of samud, of resistance. And so I think that's just one example of, within the Palestinian narrative, that desire to hold on to land and to tell the world that what's happening here is unjust.
David, we'll go to you for your question.
Well, I made a comment a little bit earlier in the piece tonight, just writing on what you said before, Ittay, about the situation, what happened with the Arabs in the Arab countries and the Jews who had to flee as a result of the birth of Israel. It's conveniently not in the Palestinian narrative, as many things that are not convenient for the Palestinian narrative are not included. And there's another thing you didn't mention today, which was 1922, when 78% of Palestine was carved off to make another Arab state, being Jordan. So the Arab Congress that met in 1919 were not appeased by the fact that the 78% of what could become Jewish homeland now was now only 22% of what the British promised in Balfour. So I'm saying that there's a lot of narrative that I'm finding that they skip over in order to make the narrative run conveniently.
Yeah, I think it's very true that the Palestinian narrative doesn't include the stories that we are aware of Jewish suffering and the legitimacy of Zionism, and sometimes even the biblical connection to this land, because obviously it would go against their claim that this land needs to be shared. And for many Palestinians, they would say that as awful as the Shoah was, and as the suffering of the Jews in Iraq and Yemen and Morocco and all of those places were, they would say, why should we suffer for that? You know, we didn't perpetrate those crimes. We didn't perpetrate the Shoah. We didn't perpetrate kicking Jews out in Iraq or in Morocco. We lived here, and as you saw in Rehovot from that clip, they said, look, our land was sold to someone else without our permission. So of course we're going to resist what they see as Zionist colonialism, because they feel that what happened here is unjust, no matter how many reasons Jews give for the necessity of the creation of a Jewish state.
We've had another question sent through in the chat. What do you think of Benny Morris's claim that the ethnic cleansing of Palestinian Arabs was necessary, suggesting that when a society tries to destroy you, you have no choice but to eradicate it?
It's a very controversial quote, and I think I don't want to start getting to my personal views, but I will just say the majority of Israelis would agree with Benny Morris and saying that ethnic cleansing, as unpleasant as it was necessary in 1948, and had that not been done, then there wouldn't be a Jewish state, because it wouldn't have had a Jewish majority. I think that the more important question here, and because I only had 45 minutes, I didn't have time to really get into all of this, but for me, the more significant question is the 1950 absentee property law, because this is the law that didn't allow Palestinians to return, and also gave over their property to Jews who remained here. And the question is, was that law essential for Israeli security or not? Because had in 1950, all the Palestinians that left, they didn't go that far, they only moved 20 kilometers away. You know, had they all been allowed to return after the war and then to take up Israeli citizenship, we would be in a very, very different place right now. So I think that the key question to ask is really, if you're looking at what ifs of history, is what would have happened if instead of the absentee property law, which gave their homes to Jews, they would have been allowed to return. But then again, had they returned after the war, would they have lived in peace, or would have that just been the recipe for another war of independence 2 or 3 years later?
We'll go to Eva now, who's got her hand raised.
With regard to narratives and David's comment that the Arabs have left out important things in the narrative, I'd like to say that the Jewish narrative is really, educationally, I was never taught, and I'd like to say this was fantastic for me, someone who's been involved in Jewish education all her life, listening to the way you presented this conflict, starting with the Russian and the Palestinian, or the Druze or Bedouin.
It was Bedouin, yeah.
That kind of presentation has never been presented to Jewish kids in Jewish day schools. And I think that is seriously problematic, because we've always been given the impression that it was rightfully ours, that they didn't want to agree to share the land. No one ever said to us they got the bad land and we got all of that information that you've given us And I think it's really problematic. People think they're doing the kids a favor by not telling them this. I think, in fact, our kids have woken up and unfortunately now are looking at Israel with much more critical eyes and not liking what they see and feeling quite alienated. And I'm seriously worried about the backlash of that, of the kids now. What do we do now when our kids turn around and feel as though they've had the wool pulled over their eyes, basically, and been given a narrative where it's all been whitewashed and they've only heard one side of the story, and now they've just swung to the other side completely. And what's your opinion about Jewish education, basically the way our kids are being educated about the conflict and how they've been taught at school?
Right. So I'll add that it's both an issue with Israeli and Jewish education. It's also an issue with Palestinian education as well. Like in both school systems, in both narratives, the legitimacy of the other side is often erased. People, you know, there was a book that sort of had a dual narrative curriculum that was proposed by Sami Adwan, wrote it about a decade ago. It wasn't accepted by the education ministry to be taught in Israel, and obviously Palestinians are not teaching anything to do with the Zionist narrative in their schools as well. And I think this type of education that sort of doesn't give legitimacy or even a space to tell the narrative of the other is a huge contributing factor to feeding the conflict, to feeling a sense of victimization by both sides, to feeling desires for revenge, tribalism, all of this sort of stuff. And I think a lot of what I would call Israel or Palestine education is not actually Israel or Palestine education at all. It's just advocacy.
Yeah.
And very, very few people do what I would call serious Israel-Palestine education that gives both narratives, that tries to explain, you know, with each event, the Palestinians thought this, the Israelis thought this, in a way that lets the student make up their own mind, because that's not the purpose of Jewish or Palestinian education. Because the purpose of these educations is to, at least for Jewish education, the purpose is to promote someone who is a Zionist, who is proud of Israel, who will defend Israel. And there's a fear that teaching them the Palestinian narrative and Mahmoud Darwish and, you know, a lot of the things we came up today will diminish their Zionist or Jewish identity. And also for Palestinians, that if they spend too much time learning about the Zionist narrative, that will weaken their love and their desire to fight and defend Palestine as well. So I understand why there's gaps in these educations, and, you know, in terms of how to change that, you can speak to school principals, which thankfully I'm not one. Yeah.
You've got the Yad B'Yad schools, which are, to me, are the only hope for the future. And I think for our kids here, we must teach them the complexity and the fact that there are two sides to the story in order to give them the feeling of pride, and they can then own their own opinion and be involved in the complexity of it, rather than try to advocate and brainwash. You know, I think that's really undermining their intelligence.
We might
I'll take that as a comment. But thank you.
we might move to the next person.
I always want to use that line from Q&A. It's my favorite line. Yeah.
We'll move to the next question from Sylvia. If you want to unmute yourself and ask away.
Hi, this is actually Sylvia's husband, Lawrence, but we're listening together. I guess, you know, when you're talking about what happened in 48, first of all, I mean, do you know the work of Martin Kramer, the historian?
Yeah.
So, I mean, he has major reservations about the Ari Shavitz book in terms of its accuracy and how things are portrayed. And if you read his article on what happened in Lida, which is, Ari Shavitz spends a lot of time talking about, you know, he points out that there was the Arab Legion, and there were a lot of armed irregulars in the city. So it was not just a city of unarmed people, but in fact there were militias and and part of the Arab Legion were in the city when all that went on. So it was really it was a part of the war, and I think we have to keep that in mind when we're seeing that this was a war for Israel's survival. And as you mentioned, you know, the famous from the river to the sea. where it's basically talking about, killing all Jews living in Israel, essentially, or getting them out in completeness. It was a war of survival, and you didn't have time for all the niceties that you might want to have when your back is to the sea. So I think you can have a very nice. I think it's very hard for us to imagine, in the way things are now in Israel, how difficult it was in 48 and how close it was.
Yeah. I want to touch on just something that Lauren said, because I'm really happy you raised that from the river to the sea quote. When you look at definitely Palestinian advocacy on social media, I follow all the Arabic social media sites, Eye on Palestine and Red for Palestine, and all of these different groups, because I'm always interested to see how they're responding to events. And I speak to Palestinians as well in Jerusalem that obviously say Free Palestine and have it on bumper stickers and that sort of thing. I think there's different expressions of what that means. For some Palestinians, it might mean violence, but for many Palestinians, it means one democratic state of Palestine, i.e. one person, one vote, which would mean that Jews would eventually be a minority here, but they would be citizens of Palestine, but without the sort of majority rights that they have as Jews in Israel at the moment, which would obviously be a catastrophe for the Zionist project. But to me, my understanding of Free Palestine often means that one democratic state with one person, one vote, rather than specifically a call to ethnic cleansing. Two accounts that I saw recently that I found quite interesting was the first is this lady from Gaza, which I follow on Instagram. It's safa.art. She does a cartoon once a week, and she did this cartoon about a year ago, which really struck me. And it's a picture of 4 children as they go through their lives, and each child says, "We will come back, we will come back, we will come back." That notion of return. And we had Tisha B'Av last week, for the Jews, where for 2,000 years we prayed to return to Jerusalem and to make the city a Jewish capital again. And I think the Palestinian desire for return, it's only been 73 years, but it wouldn't surprise me if thousands of years later, if there's no Palestinian state that's recognized, that there would still be this desire to return and to want to be independent and sovereign over a state. And then the other thing that I see often where I hear Free Palestine is these examples that you see a lot on Palestinian social media about this notion that the Nakba never ended in 1948, that what's happening now in Silwan, in Sheikh Jarrah, in Lifta, which is near Jerusalem, in Yafo, in the Negev, in Beita, where the settlement of Eviatar was established, like this notion of the Nakba didn't end in 48, it's still continuing. There's still a desire for Jews to control Palestinian lives, to remove Palestinians from their homes in order to achieve the aims of Zionism. And that again explains in a very stark way why the anti-Zionist movement among Palestinians is so strong to this day.
I think it's probably a great place to end, because we've hit a few minutes past 8:30. So with that, I think we're going to conclude the session. I'd like to say a really big thank you to Ittay for taking the time tonight, or rather the day for you, I think, to deliver such an informative session for us all.
I just want to finish just before, hold on, sorry.
Absolutely.
Just before we end up, I just wanted to, if I can give a recommendation, if you're into sort of dual narrative, and I appreciate everyone that came to this, something that's really important, I often say at the end of lots of the talks that I do on this topic, is really important that you get your news from Israel from multiple sources. You can screenshot this if you'd like to. I've listed the dominant Israeli news websites in English and their political bias as well, and the dominant Arab or Palestinian news sites that you can read in English or through Google Translate. It's really important that if you are something happens, you don't know what to think about what happened, whether it's a war or an assassination or a shooting or a peace agreement or whatever, and you want to know what do people think, like don't just read your one favorite website. Always make sure that you read multiple websites. And for those that aren't into news of the day, then the 2 books I often recommend are, for the Jewish narrative, to read Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor by Yossi Klein Halevi, and for the Palestinian narrative, where the line is drawn by Raja Shahada. Both those books, the first one is a book by a Jew written to a Palestinian in Jerusalem, and the next Raj Shahada's book is written to a Canadian Jew from a Palestinian Ramallah. But both of them are about sort of explaining their narrative to the other side with all the details of their history and religious connection and those sorts of things. And I think, you know, if you're into dual narrative, maybe doing a book club where you read both those books could also be an interesting thing to do. So I'll end with that, but thank you again for the invitation.
Some great resources. So yeah, thank you, Ittay, for taking the time or the day and delivering such an informative session for us. And of course, a big thank you to all the Zionist and Victoria sponsors, without whom our work would not be possible. Most importantly, I'd like to thank everyone that joined us for tonight's session, and thank you for your amazing interaction and helping with reading the slides and the quotes that Ittay prepared for us. Tonight's session, like all the sessions we've had, are going to be made available online via YouTube and Facebook, usually probably on a Thursday afternoon, so make sure to stay tuned for that. And the next session, which is the fourth session, entitled War and Peace, will be next Tuesday evening, also at 7:30, and it will cover the history of conflicts that have happened in Israel. So we look forward to seeing you all next week for that. Thank you again to Ittay, and good night, everybody.
Masal khair,